Hi, everyone. My name is Bava. Uh, Thank you all for joining. I so this is a conversation that we wanted to have about caste and the other diasporas, and we have with us four speakers and myself, and I will just get to it and start introducing everyone. And the order of speakers will be Preeti, Amit, myself, Esha, and then Jyotsna, followed by a conversation at the end. And also, we are open to questions from anyone, so please feel free to put it in the chat. And yeah, I'll take note of that. So I'll start by introducing Jyotsna. And Jyotsna Siddarth is an actor, anti-caste activist, and writer based in Delhi. She is a founder of Project Anti-Caste, Love, and co-founder of Sive. She has conducted workshops with colleges in Delhi University on questions of social identities and romantic relationships. She has a master's in Development and Social Anthropology and a recipient of the Chevening Scholarship 2014. And please do follow them on Instagram at Project Anti-Caste Love and at Dalit Feminism Archive. The second person is Esha Pillay. Esha is a writer based in the US whose research looks into intergenerational traumas among Indo-Fijian communities and the colonial violence of indentured histories with a specific focus on caste violence throughout the pyramid. She also co-founded Badfijigyals and currently works in education. And Preeti is a doctoral scholar at Lancaster University, UK, researching on practices of untouchability. She holds a LLM from University of Reading, UK, and is a gold medalist in BA LLB Honours from National Law School of India, University Bangalore. She is also an advocate at the High Court of Karnataka. She has recently presented a joint oral statement with Mr. Amit Anand to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As a student of NLSIU, she has interned with the National Commission for Scheduled Castes, New Delhi, with Justice Chalameshwar, Honorable Judge, Supreme Court of India, with Advocate General Karnataka and various eminent advocates. She has presented and published research widely to domestic and international audience. She has also co-authored a book chapter with Professor Susan Burr, Dean Faculty of Law, University of Victoria, Canada, in COVID-19 in Asia, Law and Policy Contexts from Oxford University Press 2020, which is the first collected volume on COVID-19 law and policy issues in Asia. Her areas of interest um, include international human rights law, Indian constitutional law, anti-discrimination laws, ancient India law, law of armed conflict, and public international law. And lastly, Amit. Oh no, actually, lastly me, but Amit first. Amit is pursuing a PhD in law at Lancaster University, UK. His PhD focuses on witch hunting, honor killing, and the Devdasi system as three forms of violence against women in India that are generally seen as non-conventional crimes. He holds an LLM in human rights from University of Reading, UK, and Amit has also recently presented a joint oral statement to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities on the issue of strengthening Article 27 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And lastly, myself, I am based in Singapore and I'm an independent researcher and I work as a paralegal. I studied in SOAS. That's how I met Jyotsna and Esha. And I'm interested in doing research about indenture, slavery, specifically migrations between Southeast Asia and South Asia. So yeah, we will start with Preeti.
Um, Thank you very much, Baba. So, hi everyone. Today I would like to present my views on caste and Hindutva within the framework of Indian Constitution. So, what is caste? Caste is basically a socio-cultural institution which is firmly rooted on the principles of graded inequality, with varied forms of inbuilt discriminations. So this institution of caste has only survived because of the existence of multiple castes. That's the caste system, which has been, protected, and it has continued for centuries through the system of endogamy, or that is conducting and allowing marriages only within the caste. But what is Hindutva? Now, Hindutva is a political ideology conceptualized and developed by Brahmin scholars with the aim to re-establish the hegemony of Brahmanism in India. But the protagonists of Hindutva, they never admit it openly. So they say that their intention is to establish a Hindu Rashtra, or a Hindu nation, based on the Hindutva ideology. So Rama, or the king of Ayodhya, in the so-called Treta Yuga, he's being projected as a symbol of pride of Hindutva, and Jai Shri Ram is its slogan. So as everybody knows, Ramaraja was a kingdom based on Chaturvarni. So Hindutva believes in and it works for strengthening of Chaturvarni. So basically, this is an ideology which believes in the system of graded inequality with inbuilt discriminations. So this is on one hand. And on the other hand, we have the Constitution of India, which expressly recognizes the existence of caste, but it declares that all laws in force in the territory of India immediately before the commencement of this constitution, insofar as they are inconsistent with the fundamental rights, shall to the extent of such inconsistency be void. And it guarantees everyone equality before law and equal protection of the laws. So the constitution discards the laws and practices imposed by the Brahmanical social order. It symbolizes its supremacy over the code of Manu. And the constitution also mandates that the state shall not discriminate against any citizen on the grounds only of religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth, or any of them. And no citizen is subjected to any disability based on these grounds. But at the same time, it's interesting to note that the constitution has empowered the state to make special provisions for the advancement of a few categories of citizens called the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, socially and educationally backward classes, women, and children. So basically, it means that the framers of the constitution have they've visualized that the group of castes which were socially and educationally deprived and marginalized in the name of God, religion, tradition, for centuries should be grouped together into different categories first, based on their historical injustices which they have suffered, and then special provisions have to be formulated for their advancement. So for this reason, the state has to be empowered accordingly. So it's true that successive governments have formulated policies for the upliftment of these deprived categories of people, which are known as affirmative action or reservation in the Indian context. But no serious and conscious effort has been made either by the state or by the civil society to transform the mindsets of the people who are identifying with their caste with concrete programs like intercaste marriages, and discarding other caste-based rituals or practices to break these barriers constructed and protected by the caste system, and to create a new belongingness in the categories in which they are included for affirmative actions. But Hindutva forces, they have attempted and they've made all efforts to make inroads into cultural spheres of these marginalized castes and establish their hegemony in the process of consolidating every single caste in the caste hierarchy, thereby preventing the unification of socially marginalized castes into constitutionally designed categories. So I think one can come to the conclusion that the structure of caste system has not changed drastically. So the introduction of the British criminal justice system in India, and with the emergence of strong dissent against the Brahminical social order and strong claims for equal opportunities in the services under the state during the British rule by the Shudras, and there were affirmative actions taken by Shah Maharaj in Maharashtra, and there was demand for reservation in employment and education by the Justice Party in Tamil Nadu in the early 20th century. And this might have forced the Brahmin scholars to explore other ways and means to protect the hegemony of Brahminism in India under the British. So while there are thousands of castes, the constitution categorizes them as scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward classes who will avail the affirmative action facilities and the rest who don't. So this was the constitution's way of bringing the oppressed under one big umbrella. Why? So they can be brought to the mainstream. So the goal is to establish an egalitarian society, and the means is to prohibit caste-based discrimination and grant affirmative action. But the key issue is that caste system is hierarchical in nature, right? So when the discrimination between castes are removed, the plane becomes horizontal. And this intention of the framers of the constitution is detrimental to Brahminism, which thrives on graded inequality. And this was recognized by them very early in time. So this is why they evolved a more polarizing ideology, Hindutva. So while the constitution tries to bring SEST, OBCs together, say for example, there are hundreds of untouchable castes under the scheduled caste, and the constitution brought all of them under one big umbrella as scheduled caste. And similar is the case with scheduled tribes and other backward classes. But what Hindutva does is it makes individual castes retain their identities while negating the broad umbrella of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward classes, and masking them under this one giant identity of Hindu. So they claim that, we are all Hindu, we are all one, and we are all family. But what appears to be an inclusive ideology is in fact pretty dangerous, because this is an illusionary identity. This basically thrives as long as castes are divided and not unified under the constitutional categories. So in the guise of being a Hindu, there is an attempt to re-establish the Brahminic social order, which is essentially casteist in nature. So it is basically an attempt to maintain the hegemony of the dominant upper caste. So Hindutva or communism or any other for that matter, if it stays as a mere ideology in the books, it is seemingly all right. And there is freedom under Article 19, and there's right under Article 25. But my issue comes in when such an ideology becomes a public policy, then there's a real danger to the democratic and egalitarian principles propounded in the Indian Constitution. So what is happening in India at present is that SCST OBCs are gradually being absorbed into Hindutva, which, as I said earlier, is basically a modern day manifestation of the ancient Hindu codes. And there's a very visible attempt to do away with the constitutional categorization of castes into SCST OBCs, thereby doing away with affirmative action programs. So the result is a denial of equality in all respects: employment, admission to educational institutions, political representation, you name it. So this is essentially bringing back the pre-constitution Hindu law prominently codified by Manu. And this, as I see, is a real threat to democracy, the secular fabric of the country, and the very essence of the Indian Constitution. So what is the remedy? Again, it lies in the Constitution itself. So there was a reason, right, why the framers of the Indian Constitution made these specific categories. They were showing who the oppressors and the oppressed are. So the key is for the oppressed, that is the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and the other backward classes, to unite and guard their rights with utmost dedication. These rights have not been just handed over to them. They have been fought for relentlessly by thousands of men and women with conviction for justice. So it's very obvious that the dominant caste would want to maintain their hegemony over the system. And as we can see how things are panning out in different parts of the country, with a growing number of caste atrocities taking place. But I think we must remember where this is heading towards. And when we can see that and we can visualize it, and I believe it becomes clear for us as to what needs to be done.
Thank you, Preeti. Um, and thank you for that whole historic talk. I think we'll go to Amit now.
Uh, Hello, everyone. So after Preeti speaking about the caste system and how that uh, how the Indian Constitution views the caste system and what it has done to in a way uh, restrict caste and restrict caste the caste system and all that comes with it. In my presentation, I'll be briefly highlighting an aspect of my PhD research, which is on violence against women in India. And I'll be specifically talking about the Devdasi system or temple prostitution, which is prevalent in the southern states of India. Now, the main focus of my presentation is to basically argue for the need of an analysis of caste and gender as intersecting and interlocking systems of aggression. So, as we know in the Indian context, the caste system is considered an important aspect of the social sphere. And like how Preeti mentioned in her presentation, caste plays a significant role in determining both the social division of labor as well as the sexual division in India. For instance, if you look at the Devdasi system, in this particular system, you have young girls belonging to the Dalit community uh, who are married to a Hindu deity and then sexually exploited by temple priests and members of the higher caste. Uh, the dedication ritual it usually occurs before the girl reaches puberty, and it requires the girl to become sexually available for everyone in the community. Now, traditionally or historically, it is believed that these girls are supposed to be serving society as ordained by the goddess or the deity. And in other words, the Devdasis, uh, they are considered as courtesans in God's court, and due to their sacred condition and their belonging to the divinity, a Devdasi cannot be married to one particular man. Instead, she is considered a property of the entire community. Now, as noted by uh, Mishra and Rao in their work on evolution and devolution of the Devdasi system in India, apart from recruiting labor for the maintenance of temples, there was also a religious sentiment attached to dedicating young girls during the medieval period in India. So, and this is significant because it ties with what Preeti was talking about, how the how the caste system from time immemorial has been it has remained the way it has been, and it's very stagnant despite the constitutional provisions and despite various legislations that have tried to put an end uh, to practices, to rituals that are the outcome of a hierarchical system because of the whole caste and what it in a way does to the social fabric of India. Now, with regard to the Devdasi system, it was said and believed that the dedication of dance or song by young girls, it somehow became more meritorious than other offerings like flowers and food in the temple. It somehow helped fulfilling all desires and equal in virtues to the performance of the sacrifice. Now, since the chastity of a virgin was considered to be of incomparable value, sacrificing one's chastity to the god as a Devdasi was also taken as one of the highest virtues. Uh, Now, due to all these religious and historical beliefs and community beliefs, Girls were sacrificed to temples. The kings and nobles, they often appointed or presented well-trained girls to temples and made rich endowments. The rich class devotees uh, also purchased girls from poor class parents and offered them for the service of the gods. Now, with regard to the Devdasi system, if you look at the practice in contemporary India, another important aspect worth noting is with respect to the number of Devdasis in the Indian states where the practice is still existing. Now, there is obviously a lack of official data, and this has been identified by many scholars, which is a major hindrance when it comes to understanding and prohibiting the practice in the first place. Now, it was only in 2015 when an affidavit was filed in the Supreme Court of India uh, by the National Commission for Women, in which the National Commission said that there were around 250,000 Dalit girls dedicated in various temples across the Karnataka and Maharashtra state border alone. Now, uh, uh, we need to understand that the data that the government presents is not always the correct one, but this is one of the official records that we have uh, because of an NGO approaching the Supreme Court of India, asking the Supreme Court to immediately stop a dedication ceremony. And because of that, the Supreme Court then asked the National Commission for Women to present whatever data it had with regard to how many Dalit girls were dedicated in temples in the southern states in India. Now, what is interesting to note that in this particular affidavit itself, an officer of the National Commission for Women also acknowledged that despite the state of Karnataka having passed a legislation called the Karnataka Devdasi Prohibition of Dedication Act in 1982 to prohibit temple dedication, there had been no study undertaken either on the status of Devdasi or on the implementation of the said legislation since the time it was passed. Now, uh, there was this very recent case which made the papers. And it was only in February this year, wherein in a particular district in Karnataka, a 19-year-old girl was rescued by the local police when she tipped off the police about her parents' plan to dedicate her as a Devdas. When the police did their investigation, they found that the mother was a Devdasi and she wanted her daughter to be also dedicated to the temple. And somehow the daughter got news about what her parents were planning, and she was able to uh, contact the police, and that's how this case came into light. Otherwise, there are so many other cases which are which we don't know about simply because and it's also because of the legislation and the, the very little bit of awareness that has come around because of local NGOs working in this area, that the whole dedication process in a way has gone underground, and it's just not visible to the public eye anymore. But that doesn't mean that it's not taking place. Now, as we all know, that caste in India is a social, political, and economic reality, and the Dalit community are placed at its bottom. Now, as a result, the Dalit community has been denied opportunities in every sphere of life, such as education, employment, and healthcare. Moreover, there are numerous instances of caste-based violence against Dalits in the form of murder and rape, which are reported on a daily basis. The idea of the polluted bonded servant is somehow so ingrained in the subcontinental mind that the Dalit continues to remain at the bottom of the intellectual and emotional landscape of contemporary India, regardless of how far he or she may advance in public career and even agitate for social change. Now, majority of Dalits today still live in rural areas and they continue to face discrimination. Now, since large sections of the Dalit population live below the poverty line and have no access to jobs, they are forced to either work as bonded laborers or take up caste designated occupations such as manual scavenging and several others. Now, we need to acknowledge that the discrimination faced especially by Dalit women, is closely associated with the Hindu religion, which has a significant role in the subjugation of all women in India. Now, controlling female movement and their sexuality is crucial to maintaining the patriarchal ideology and caste hierarchy under the Hindu religion. Now, this control is also exercised rigidly on upper caste women. As far as Dalit women are concerned, under the Hindu religion, they have always been portrayed as opposites to the so-called virtuous upper caste women. While upper caste women were shown to be of high moral character, Dalit women were depicted as loud, unfaithful, and immoral. Dalit women were said to also live in temporary marriages, have questionable sexual morals, and experience frequent divorces and desertions. They were seen as sex objects by the high caste men. The Dalit female body, while represented as unfeminine, was also perceived as lustful. She was unattractive but alluring. Her body was both at the same time repulsive and desirable, untouchable but available. And we need to understand uh, uh, what the Hindu social order and what is Hindu social order and how that is in a way related to female subordination in India and how that is different when it comes to upper caste women and Dalit women. So there is a general subordination of women in India, but there is also this othering of women that happens that upper caste women are subjugated in a separate form, and the subjugation is different when it comes to Dalit women and tribal. Now, despite various studies revealing that Dalit women suffer from gender bias, caste discrimination, and economic deprivation at the same time, there has been no comprehensive effort made to understand the intersectional issues of caste and gender. In majority of cases, Dalit women uh, face more violence than Dalit men because of the belief that by targeting of Dalit women, dominant caste groups can bring down the honor of Dalit men. Further, apart from facing sexual violence, Dalit women also suffer in almost every other aspect of their life due to the caste gender intersectionality. Now, according to the data from the National Family Health Survey in 2018, Dalit women in India, they die younger than upper caste women, face discrimination in accessing of healthcare, and lag behind on almost all health indicators. Now, the concept of intersectionality here becomes important, especially in the case of Dalit women, because it helps to uncover those hidden reasons behind the various forms of atrocities faced by them. It, it helps shine light at the close relationship of caste, class, and gender, and how these operate as a tool for social exclusion and oppression in India. In the Indian society, where day-to-day relationships are governed by community norms based on caste and gender, the social power over resources, it tends to lie mostly in the hands of the dominant caste. In such a situation, an assertion of rights, especially by Dalit women, invites anger of the dominant caste groups, mostly in the form of sexual violence. Further, most of such instances of atrocities against Dalit women, although they take place in public, but they are very rarely reported, with offenders hailing mostly from the dominant caste who exercise influence over the state and its resources. Victims of caste atrocities often do not report any form of violence, fearing further backlash. In short, a focus on the intersection of different factors that often result in discrimination, violence, and deprivation. Uh, it will help in understanding the varied patterns of atrocities against Dalit women and also uncover societal norms and beliefs that contribute to such practices. So finally, I'll conclude by saying that, especially with regard to the Devdasi practice, if it if it's going to be better understood as an outcome of the use of both caste and gender, which binds Dalit women and their families in perpetual cycle of discrimination in the name of social and religious custom. We need to not look at as a separate as something that's happening in isolation or it's happening to uh, uh, in a very small number, but we need to really look at the whole uh, social cultural norm and the whole social cultural reality of India within which this this practice is taking place. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Preeti, for really setting the context of caste in India. So I'm going to try and give a very succinct summary of caste in Singapore and Malaysia, specifically the Indian community in Singapore and Malaysia. So generally, about 9% of Singapore's population are Singaporean Indians, and in Malaysia, about 7% of the population over there are Malaysian Indians. So both Singapore and Malaysia have very similar colonial labor migration movements. And the two most prominent labor migrations that saw the largest group of Indians migrating were the indenture system and the Kangani system. So there are some differences that I think I will have to mention before I start. Is that in Malaysia there were way more plantations, whereas in Singapore there were more urban construction projects where coolie workers worked. So, and also an important wave of migration that happened in Singapore, which I hope we can discuss later, was the transportation of convict laborers from India. So Singapore was a penal colony where Indian convict laborers were sent. And convict laborers were the first people to build the infrastructure in the country. So, but now I'll be focusing on the indenture and the Kangani system. And especially the Kangani system, because I think it shows very clearly how caste was used to construct this Indian coolie figure in the region. So specifically in the 1870s onwards, there was a huge migration of specifically Tamils from Tamil Nadu who began to enter Singapore and Malaysia in great numbers as menial laborers. And the majority were working in plantations and as construction workers in urban centers. So during this period, people from lower caste and Dalit backgrounds became a highly visible community in Singapore and Malaysia. So the indenture system was basically this contract system where workers signed a contract for several years and were bonded to work in a colony. This system started to basically keep up with the cheap labor that the colonial economy needed following the abolishment of slavery. And this contract element gave this idea that people were consenting to working. And a lot of colonial reports and laws, they talk about indenture to purposefully distance itself from previous previous systems such as the transatlantic slave trade. Now, specifically the Kangani system, which is what I'll be focusing on, was this system that phased out the indenture system in Singapore and Malaysia. The Kangani comes from the Tamil word the overseer, and this was usually a middleman recruiter who usually worked for the colonial government, who would return to their respective villages in Tamil Nadu, India, to recruit people, usually making promises of opportunities and bright futures. So this Kangani would be this influential figure in village life with more money and always of a higher dominant caste background. So Kanganis would target those of lower caste backgrounds who could not own land or who lost a little land. So to give some context, this also was happening in the late 1800s where famine and droughts were very widespread throughout India and also in Tamil Nadu. So because of horrible colonial policies. So this served as an important push factor for migration as well. So colonial officials would use language and justification such as the poverty and famine that caused these communities to be under perpetual and hereditary bondage will be interpreted to mean that Tamil coolies were more suited to a regimented life in the plantation, since they have been accustomed to a life of oppression and servility. And so this means that they can now adapt to the harsh conditions of living on plantations. So this was the kind of language that was used in the Singaporean and Malaysian context. So this highlights how caste and race work together to construct this Tamil Indian coolie worker in order for him to fit into this colonial capitalist economy. And because the higher caste Kangani is seen as the overseer, the one who takes care of the lower caste laborer, who then reports to the British worker, you can see how caste and race are working together to oppress the Indian coolie worker. And in fact, in the Singaporean Malaysian context, the British preferred the Kangani system over the indenture system because they were not it's a very hands-off operation for them. So and also the system of indenture was abolished in the late 1880s. In Singaporean history and Malaysian history, those who have been recruited under the Kangani system are deemed as free migrants. Although many people have written about this, both systems, the Kangani system and Indenture system, operated on this spectrum of deceit and coercion. So this Kangani system would go on to operate in Singapore and Malaysia as late as the 1910s, 1920s. And then this question of how did then Indians settle down in Singapore and Malaysia comes into our minds, right? Like, so there were two ways that I will focus on that I think are very relevant today was how the British enabled for Indians to settle down in Singapore and Malaysia. So first, there was this widespread establishment of toddy shops. And second, the giving of plots of land to construct temples. Now, important habit that the British really encouraged within the specific Tamil Kuli community in Singapore and Malaysia was the consumption of toddy, which is a fermented alcoholic beverage. And at one point, every plantation estate in Malaysia had a toddy shop attached to it. And in Singapore as well, many toddy shops were set up specifically targeting Tamil Kuli workers. So this clearly encouraged the toddy consumption among Indian workers, and there was a growing dependence on alcohol due to how cheap it was, but also how intoxication helped laborers to get by with the hard physical labor that was required of them. Now, secondly, the British also granted small plots of land to laborers to construct temples. This was a very important technique that was used by the British to tie laborers to specific places. In fact, to curb laborers from absconding or leaving their plantations or compounds. So temples for Tamil folk deities. So this is a very specific kinds of temples that were being constructed for Tamil folk deities, non-Brahminic deities that are still very common in Singapore and Malaysia today. Now, since both countries have gained independence in different ways, the Indian coolie worker figure is always seen as this outsider or this violent drunkard or someone who creates disorder when they are not working. And this still impacts both communities today in many ways and also impacts the current migration of Tamil migrant workers from Tamil Nadu today. Because a large population of migrant workers in Singapore and Malaysia who help construct the infrastructure projects in the countries today are also from Tamil Nadu and countries such as Bangladesh. So in both countries, Indians are today in Singapore and Malaysia, in both countries, Indians are in prison disproportionately. In Singapore, according to prison reports, about 90% of death row inmates are from minority backgrounds, meaning they're either Indian or Malay. Given that Indians make up 9% of the population and Malays make up 11% of the population, it's a very stark figure. And in Malaysia, despite Indians only making up 7% of the population, Malaysian Indians account for 55% of deaths in custody. I mean, these are statistics, but when I was doing the notes for this event, I said two Malaysian Indians died this month. But when I'm speaking to you, I've just found out that a third person has died this month in police custody. So yeah, it's a very prevalent issue that happens in Malaysia. And on a day-to-day basis, I think something we see is that the criminal justice system does not afford the Indian population the rehabilitation or leniency that it might afford to the majority races in both countries. So a very specific incident that I think really brings out why Hindutva should be talked about in Singapore and Malaysia was the demolition of the Sri Maduri Veeran temple in Alor Seta, Kada in 2020. So this temple was built by railway workers during the colonial era from land granted to them by the British. So, however, the Kada state government went ahead with demolishing the temple by claiming that it was built illegally. So these kinds of demolitions of temples that were specifically built by lower caste coolie workers and plantation workers to these specific Tamil deities have been getting demolished for decades now. Now, the worrying development that I think it's important to address is that Hindutva groups have utilized these events to strengthen and spread their their political beliefs. For example, the Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh USA branch, which is known to be linked to the RSS in India, condemned this temple demolition that happened in Malaysia. So you can see that these communities are being used as a case study, but no historical analysis being given of who these people are or how did they end up here. So in both countries, the state always wants to erase the history of these labor migrations, these specifically the indenture labor migration and the Kangani labor migration, and how specifically lower caste Tamil people's labor has been used to build much of the country. In Singapore, the version of history that gets fed to the Indian population is always this point of view of the merchant communities or the Indian businessmen, because we cannot forget that there were also very dominant caste people who migrated and who were very influential and powerful, who benefited from colonialism in many ways. So, and in Malaysia as well, the educated civil servant or the merchant is the one that we use to represent the Indian community. Although about 80% of both populations come from a coolie community, coolie background. So this idea of it being convict laborers or indentured workers or free migrants from the Kangani system to now modern day migrant workers on these short-term employment visas, there's this idea that Tamil Indians who do work are always foreign or invisible in this region, but also are essential for the country to be built. And I think this is specifically how the Indian coolie is being constructed in these two countries. And caste has been a very big part of the equation. So yeah, that's me. Thank you. I will now pass it on to Esha, who will speak, and then we'll have a small discussion at the end. Thank you. Anyone who has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I will take note of everything. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. So my name is Esha Pillay. My pronouns are she, her, and I am calling in from California, US this morning. Well, it's morning on my end. I'm just pulling up my notes. Sometimes I go off script, but I'm just gonna have it here so I don't get distracted. Yeah, so just to start off, so I am a 5th generation Indo-Fijian, and I come from an indentured labor history. So that means, you know, over 100 years ago, my ancestors were brought over to work on the colonial plantations in Fiji. So for folks who might not know, you know, where Fiji is or what are all of the different communities that make up, you know, the Fiji Islands. So it's a small island country, or it's a group of islands in the South Pacific region, in the South Pacific Ocean. And you have the indigenous Fijians or Itoke, and then you have the Indo-Fijians, or those of us who come from Girmit or indentured labor histories. And then you also have some smaller like Chinese communities who have settled in the area, as well as recent migrants from like different places. So going back to indentured labor, you know, like Bava spoke about in the Singapore, Malaysia context, you have a lot of people coming from like South India, you know, coming from Tamil Nadu. But in the context of Fiji, the majority of the laborers came from the north. So that's like present day Uttar Pradesh, Bihar. But you also have some people who claim heritage from Bengal, Rajasthan, Punjab, and then also Nepal and, you know, what's now Pakistan. Then you had a much smaller group of, you know, people and communities who came from the southern regions of the subcontinent, but all leaving off from the port of Madras. So I come from that community and identify as Mandaraji. And for those, you know, who have joined this call today and might not know, like how indentured labor started, you know, Bava mentioned this, but just to like, you know, say it again, it was in 1833 when chattel slavery was becoming abolished or becoming illegal. So that's chattel slavery through the transatlantic slave trade via the Middle Passage. European colonizers looked towards the Indian or like the subcontinent for laborers to continue this labor exploitation in their plantation economies. But then in the context of Fiji, yes, our history is linked to the transatlantic slave trade, but then we also have blackbirding. So for folks who don't know, blackbirding, or it's also referred to as the Pacific slave trade, was when Europeans kidnapped, displaced, and like stole different indigenous communities from their homes to take them to work on other plantations across other islands in the Pacific. So I think when it came to understanding, you know, my own history as a Girmith descendant, as a Coolie person, you know, someone who comes from indentured labor, I think understanding these histories were helpful for me, because then it kind of gave me an insight to as where my own history begins, because I can't talk about my own histories without looking at these other histories as well. And then going on to what caste looks like in the Indo-Fijian community. So, you know, Indo-Fijians will often talk about how we are casteless. You know, we don't practice caste anymore. And that's because, you know, our ancestors, when they were in the ports before they came over to Fiji, were in such close quarters together. So they're eating together, sleeping together. And, you know, when they came over on the ships and then finally to Fiji, they were all working on the sugarcane plantations together. So there's this common narrative and there's this logic that, you know, caste hierarchies don't exist in our communities because we all came from laboring backgrounds. Like all of our ancestors were laborers who worked on, you know, sugarcane plantations. But then what happens is, you know, when I was learning even my own family stories, I started hearing these stories when I was growing up, you know, like how my family and how my ancestors experienced caste violence and experienced caste discrimination from other Girmith descendants. So as I was hearing these stories in my own family, I was like, wait a minute, something is wrong. You know, I hear this narrative all the time that, you know, we Fiji Indians or we Indo-Fijians, like, no, we don't have caste. That's something that happens in India. We left that behind. But then at the same time, you know, my own reality and my family's reality was that they were facing a lot of caste violence, whether it was, you know, physical violence that was directed towards my family members, or people not wanting to marry into our family, or people, you know, saying they're a bad family. You know, but then we have to like think, what does a bad family mean if it's not, you know, like a casteist understanding or logic. And it was only much later on when I met other Dalit people and Dalit women specifically who, you know, brought me into the community, and I was learning about the history of caste in the subcontinent and how caste comes and shows up in so many forms. So even when people say we are not casteist, you know, caste doesn't exist. It's showing up in Indo-Fijian communities through religion, you know, how people's values are policed, how women's bodies are policed, you know, what's clean, what's dirty, you know, what's pure, what's polluted, food restrictions, especially around eating beef, you know, if you're considered Hindu. And what does that say about families, you know, who eat beef? So it's all of these different things, you know, it's spread all throughout the culture, but the narrative will still be that we don't believe in caste. So in addition to that, something else I also wanted to bring up is in Fiji, we have different periods of movement. So of course we have the indentured laborers who came, but then there was also a point after that there was free migrants coming from the subcontinent. So these are migrants, you know, who have the caste privilege, who have the class privilege as well. And today in Fiji, when you see these families, you know, who have really successful businesses, you know, they own really successful shops, they have a lot of generational wealth, people will think, oh, you know, Indo-Fijians are doing really well. You know, they're so successful, and they'll try to put that sort of image and success and, you know, like respectability against those of us who are descendants of indenture, but then also oppose that identity against indigenous Fijians. So those are some of the things that make up like the current politics on the islands and even in the diaspora. But one example that I can give that I came across, that also brings up caste issues in our community. So just to backtrack a little bit, so I'm also a part of this collective called Badfijigyals, which I co-founded with my research partner, Chevening. She is based in Aotearoa, which is New Zealand, and she is a textile maker and a researcher. So when I teamed up with her, I was really excited to work with another descendant of indenture. And one of our research papers and projects looked at a labor strike in Fiji in the 1920s. So this labor strike was happening with the public workers in the major cities in Fiji. And basically folks were, fighting for better working conditions, better, wages, and just even like safer working conditions. But at the same time, Gandhi actually had sent Dr. Manilal over to Fiji, who was somebody that he was working with to, fight for or advocate for our rights. And this actually is a really an important part of history, because it's during this point where the narrative changes that this upper caste, Indian man, this lawyer, came over to Fiji to save our ancestors and to fight for our rights. When actually this is a key moment where you see how Hindu nationalism is traveling over to Fiji and really trying to secure their power in the region, as if descendants of indenture, cannot fight for their rights. And this really contrasted with how our ancestors, so descendants of indenture, were physically fighting back. So, there's this one history of the workers fighting for, better wages and better working conditions, but then also argued with ancestors on the colonial plantations. They used a lot of physical violence to fight back, whether it was the plantation owners, Indian plantation owners, or even white plantation owners. And there's another example of, the women's gang. So women on the plantations, because they were experiencing so much physical and sexual violence, they would gang up together and fight the overseers. But when you come to the history, even when me and my research partner were doing the research for this, these sorts of oral histories are really hard to come across. Everything will usually point to the upper caste Indian that Gandhi sent over, to fight for like the conditions that our ancestors were experiencing. So before I continue, I just want to make sure that I'm okay on time. Bava hasn't sent me a message, so it seems like I'm okay. Okay. Yeah, so outside of this, historical and contemporary context, I think I was really interested in joining this panel. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who spoke before me, because there's a little bit of everything that I can definitely relate to the work that I'm doing. And I'm really happy to be in the space, because I want to ask, all of you folks, like, how do we build anti-caste education and political education in our indentured communities? Because I really think that is what is missing. For me personally, even though I was experiencing caste discrimination and caste violence, I did not have the language to talk about it, because, it is just so different being from an indentured background. So I will forever be grateful, for like the Dalit women who brought me into the community. And, I'm still learning. I'm still learning how to get the language right, and I know everybody's, experiences, even when you are oppressed caste, is very different. And it definitely depends on your geography. So another thing I wanted to mention as I'm kind of bringing this to a close is Girmith descendants and descendants of indenture do absolutely experience caste violence from dominant caste and oppressor caste people from South Asia and the South Asian diaspora. So for me, growing up in the US, it was like really blatant, really explicit caste discrimination from upper caste or dominant caste people. And even if they didn't know my exact caste location, all they needed to know was that I was from Fiji. And they had this automatic, this light bulb went off in their head. She comes from some sort of low caste laboring background. That's all they needed to know. So I think because indentured descendants, so many indentured descendants have that sort of experience with dominant caste communities, they take on this narrative that like, yes, all of our ancestors, were low caste, or they were Dalit, or they were Adivasi. But in the context of Fiji, that's not true. It was a mix of different casted folks, in addition to Dalit communities and Adivasi communities that were brought over. So I think when it comes to anti-caste politics and anti-caste education, I think for indentured descendants, there really needs to be, they really need to actively want to learn about these histories, because I think it will help with the sort of discrimination that they face with South Asians, with dominant caste South Asians from the subcontinent and in the diaspora. But I also think, when we are reconnecting with our roots, depending on, thinking about where our ancestors came from in South Asia, when we're thinking about religious customs, values, family practices, when we're in that reconnection process, we tend to gravitate towards mainstream South Asian culture, which is the dominant, the oppressor caste, the upper caste South Asian culture. And I think that's really harmful for us. When you have shitty things like Bollywood and, coolie people and indentured diasporas, Bollywood is something that's so huge, a part of our communities, because we see things in Bollywood and we're like, oh my God, India, I somehow kind of relate. But at the end of the day, we do come from laborers, and these things are problematic and they are harmful for us. I think, we are in a great position because we come from this laboring background that we can stand in better solidarity with other oppressed caste people in South Asia, indigenous communities across South Asia. We are in a perfect position to do that. So I think that's kind of where I'm leaving this at. I think there's a lot of room for us to be a part of anti-caste, education and conversation. So hopefully, I'm speaking about this, you all are speaking about this. And when we think about, anti-caste organizing, I think having indentured communities and people from indentured backgrounds is really important and really necessary. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Esha, for introducing Fiji and also the US. That's very important. Yeah, so now I'll pass it on to Jyotsna.
Thanks, Esha, Bava, and Global Research Network for having me here. It's been really nice to listen to other panelists, and I have actually 3 slides that I would like to share. Yeah, okay. So, I feel like today that we're talking about Hindutva and caste. I think it's important that we begin with pandemic because that's what we're all going through right now, but also the disproportionate impact of pandemic intertwined with violence in India at the moment, where there are a lot of young activists have been incarcerated and put in jails. So we're going through a very severe political turmoil at the moment in the country, and we're seeing a lot of history changing. We're seeing that there's a lot of breaking down of architectural buildings and historic buildings in India, where I think it's probably going to be the first country that destroyed its own national museum. So and national archives, and so in middle of that, we're seeing that there is a saffronization of the history textbooks is being done, where the history is being now tweaked and a false narrative is sort of being put out. I was reading that in one of the states in India, Gujarat, there was a historical narrative that was being shared that Gandhi actually committed suicide. So these kind of things that are being pushed, where I think the challenge for the country would be that there will be a whole generation that will grow up with a very different sense of history and on false narratives, and that's going to be be difficult to navigate in the middle of the caste system and all the other gender inequalities that we have been historically going through, and still they're absolutely rampant. So there's also been an attack on educational institutions. So the most uh, pioneering in educational institutions like FTII and TIS and Jamia have come under attack. A lot of penetration of right-wing forces have happened in education institutions, in government offices. So we're seeing that everywhere there is a whole capturing of not just society but media and political institutions, government institutions. Um, we might know that Prime Minister of India had issued a care fund where he asked for a lot of donations. So big corporate organizations, big industrialists, and even a lot of government official salary was being deducted to be donated to the PM Care Fund. And nobody really knows where that money is, because it doesn't even come under the Right to Information Act. Then we've also seen that, you know, there's been a PIL to remove secular and socialist word from the Constitution of the India and Constitution of India. And apart from that, there's been many amendments that have been made, and that we're seeing that constantly the Constitution is under attack. Recently, there was a reservation for upper caste that was enforced, where 10% reservation is being given on the grounds of economically backward sections who fall under the general category, which may not be the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribe, but the upper caste Hindus, upper caste people as well. And we're continuing to see there is, in the middle of the pandemic, there's still arrests are being happening of anti-caste activists, but also other activists. The voices of dissent, all of that is being under attack at this moment. So we're seeing this really amalgamation of violence and pandemic and tyranny and a lot of political power being enforced, where you're constantly left helpless and you don't know what to do, how to navigate this, because we're also witnessing this for the first time. Not the caste system, but you know, the amalgamation of all these forces. And I think COVID makes it hard. The pandemic makes it hard, because when it started and the lockdown started, even now we constantly use the term social distancing, but we don't use the word physical distancing. And then people say that this is not about caste, but I mean, we've been doing social distancing for decades and decades. Which is why it's easier for Indians to understand what it means to quarantine, to you know, also the lockdown, because we're used to doing this. This is the system that our society is based on, segregation and distancing. But now with COVID, everything has sort of become very sort of volatile. And you know how people say that we are not untouchables, don't treat us like untouchables, and obviously because the untouchable is the other. And then with COVID, there's been graphic images of dead bodies that we've been seeing in the media, where because the state didn't provide for health services or protection, even there was a massive lack of oxygen for a few months, and lakhs and lakhs of people have died simply because this is what I call the state-sponsored genocide, because you're denying the medical services to people when they're really at the brink of vanishing. But then it kind of gets linked to the caste, because people who dispose the dead bodies, people who perform post-mortem on the dead bodies, people who bury the dead belong to the so-called low caste, the Dalits, the Dalit community. So reporters have been, journalists have been showing that on many occasions where there was a COVID death, the family members themselves have denied to touch the body or to give them or pay them last rites. So there has been an extreme burden on the community, on Dalit community, to perform these last rites, sometimes on the behalf of family and strangers. Um, and in that, I think they've always been at the front line, but now their life has become completely only about performing this, and actually not just performing but engaging into this kind of hard physical labor of even disposing the dead bodies of other people, which they've been doing, but I'm talking about in context of COVID, that it's just become far more precarious. And the bodies of Dalits, particularly women, queer, and trans folks, have been at the sideline as well, because in the pandemic we're seeing that these are the folks who do not have support system or networks or resources and safe spaces to be, because in longer periods of lockdown, people have lost sense of security and even community. Everybody is very sort of internal and focused, because the nature of the disease is such that you cannot be physically present, so it's just become quite complex. And at the same time, we're seeing the state sanctioned impunity, where buildings are being destroyed, new buildings have been made, the names of the roads and cities have been changed. So in a way, there is this separate parallel project that's been going on along with the pandemic, and that hasn't stopped. Um, and I mean, we're seeing that obviously the police, state, and media are in the nexus, and they all belong to the dominant caste groups. So there's a whole false narrative that's being created. Um, and what is happening is that obviously people who are at the margins, at the fringes, have lost a lot of protection and safeguard measures from the state, because state has completely sort of denied its responsibility towards the citizens, where people from disadvantaged backgrounds were never the priority. And there is this political performance that we're seeing on TV, where our prime minister comes every few months and announces and declares, but but when the dead bodies were showing up and news were covering it, he was nowhere to be found. He never even made a statement, and that itself shows complete negligence from his side and disinterest in sort of sharing that. So, I mean, I'll stop here and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Jyotsna, for giving the current context as well with COVID and all the news we've been seeing. So I'll start with the broader questions, and then we'll go on to the specific questions. So we have one. Could you share any recommended or favorite books, literature on caste-based discrimination and Dalits in India? Maybe everyone could share one, and then we could move on to the next question for everybody.
Okay, I have quite a few actually. There's Annihilation of Caste by Dr. Ambedkar. There's Caste in India. It's just, they're very small books. They're not like heavy reading, something very small. Then you have Riddles in Hinduism. There's another very important book by Brij Ranjan Mani. It's called Debrahmanizing Indian History. And basically collected works of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. You'll find much of everything, what Congress has done to India, and what Congress and Gandhi has done to the untouchables, who are the Shudras and the untouchables in general and everything. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think Preeti has mentioned the most important ones. So yeah, I think the collected works of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, I think that itself is in a way enough in terms of getting not only a basic understanding but also like it would give the reader, like an opportunity to ask deeper questions and understand not only caste but how Indian society functions. So yeah, and I think she mentioned caste in India, the mechanism, genesis, and development. So yeah, that book.
Great. Esha, Jyotsna, would you like to share?
I think Preeti and Amit, they covered it really well. I actually have one book right by my side right now. This is the book Baba gave me. It's called Virama, The Life of an Untouchable. I would highly recommend that folks, if you can grab this to read this book. And that's all.
Great. Jyotsna, I would love to hear as well.
I actually wrote in the chat box, Cracked
great.
Mirror, edited by Gopal Guru and Sundar Sarokai. It's a really good read.
Okay. I think thank you all. I think I can only maybe speak more about the Singaporean Malaysian side. There's this book by John Solomon called The Disappearance of Untouchability in Singapore. I think that was a great book. I will write it down in the chat. But yeah, I think everyone else has covered a lot of very cool books. So I'll go to the second question that's posed for everyone. Could I ask, how do you address this co-opting of anti-colonial sentiment by Hindutva forces to push a false narrative of caste-based history?
Yeah, so I don't think, me personally, I don't think it needs to be addressed because it's a democracy and everyone has their own freedom of speech and everything. For me, and what I want my community to do is to fight for the constitutional rights, right, enshrined in the constitution, and press the state for delivering that, because state is mandated by the constitution to perform certain tasks, and that's not been done. So basically what's happening is, we are engaging in things which we're engaging in things which I don't think that needs to be engaged, instead of uh, engaging in what has to be engaged in. So that's me.
Bava, can you just repeat that question again?
Yeah, I mean, I think with this question, how Preeti has talked about going for the constitution in India, in the indenture context, we find out that a lot of protests happened with a caste dimension, with the anti-caste dimension, right? And yeah, I'd like to know, so how can we from the peripheries, from the outside of subcontinent, come in to this discussion?
So I think for us, how I mentioned, with how Girmitiyas or indentured laborers were really physically fighting back on the colonial plantations. So like one of the things, that they did that really shook both upper caste or oppressor caste Indians and even the British colonial figures was that they weren't scared to physically use their bodies to fight back. And with the women's gang specifically, they did this thing, anytime when they thought, someone was going to get sexually assaulted, or, someone was going to be, like a victim of rape, they would call out each other, and all the women would come together and, like physically beat up the man or the perpetrator. And I think a lot of these stories, they sit outside of like official written history. So I think another thing we have to do in our indentured communities when, we're trying to be included in the conversation is to make sure we can document these stories and document these stories in how they actually played out and what the reality was, without trying to, clean up the history. Because I think with indentured histories, when you have Indian nationalists and, oppressor caste people coming into our communities, they really try to push respectability onto us. They want to be like, we protested, we wrote petitions, we did things in a very neat and tidy way, which is not true for our ancestors. like their bodies was, very much a part of, like being anti-caste and protesting, which doesn't make sense to oppressor caste people.
Yeah, so for me, I think this question, it's more or less, it has to do with not acknowledging what the reality of Indian society, and the caste, especially the caste-based reality, and trying to put the blame uh, to this whole idea that caste is not, it's not to be understood as a problem as how it's portrayed by writers from the West, or people who are not from India, or who are not aware of the reality of what Hindu society is, or how the social fabric it works, and especially they don't understand what the day-to-day relationship is. So it's like and we see that a lot when it comes to uh, you know uh, in the translation of religious books, uh, especially religious Hindu books, and it's like it's been translated by a foreign author, so they obviously don't get what our religion is and what we have been following from centuries. So in a way, trying to put the blame there that whatever is being talked about, it's not what India is, and everything is fine, and this is how we operate, and there is no basically there's no problem. So like how my research points towards gender-based discrimination and violence against women, and it tries to look at the historical, it tries to trace its origins in history, in religion, in sociology, and tries to understand why Dalit women, or say tribal women, are being subjected to torture, to rape, and various other forms of violence in the name of in the name of religion, or basically trying to understand why all of this is considered a normal practice. So in a way, I mean, it has been said in a lot of literature that uh, we just don't understand, or we just don't see caste or caste-based violence in India as a problem. And the debate should start from there, that it is a problem, and then we need to talk about those forms of caste-based violence which don't make the news very often. So this whole anti-colonial sentiment uh, that the West doesn't understand what India is, and they didn't really understand how we work, and how the society works, or how relationships are formed, and they are nurtured in, say, villages in India, and that's the true India, and everything is fine over there. And so yeah, for me, this question, it points towards all of those.
Thanks, Sumit. I mean, you've covered a lot in that. Preeti, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, so basically their narrative is that the Britishers have come to India, and they have divided and they've invented caste, and there's basically a division of everything. But as Babasaheb Ambedkar points out, that caste system obviously it was existing for centuries before the British came to India, and caste system is not just a division of labor, right? It's a division of laborers into watertight compartments. So you're born in a particular caste, you live there and you die there. There's no mobility. So this is a system which has been existing even before the British. So as I said earlier, I don't think we'll have to address what the propagates of Hindutva nationalists they're saying, because I would want what we as people who believe in constitution and democracy want to do in this country, and that is fight for our constitutional rights. And one of the basic things about Brahmanism is creating confusion, and they would go on doing that. So we'll just get caught up in engaging in things which we can just skip, and focus on things which we ought to focus on. So yeah.
Thank you, Preeti and Amit. So there's two questions. I mean, it's one question, but it also ties to this question. Um, I think Esha, we have a question for you. Generational wealth is such an important topic. Could you please elaborate on what it is and how it relates to your research? And this also ties to another question that someone asked about how upper caste immigration into countries like Singapore alter the existing post-caste Indian society. I mean, does it alter the existing post-caste Indian society, and if so, in what ways? So, yeah, Asha, would you like to answer the question, and then I could jump in?
Sure. So my question is around generational wealth, right? And do you want me to kind of just explain what I meant by that?
Yeah, how do you approach it in your research? Yeah.
Okay. I think with generational wealth, you know, in Fiji, how we see that is when you see, families who have a lot of like who are, rich or, who own, these really big businesses, they usually are not descendants of indenture. They are the people who came over, with who have caste privilege that came over as like free migrants in Fiji. So that's how that kind of plays out. And in the context of Fiji, with so we're a country. We've had multiple military coups that have to do with ongoing tensions that both has to do with our colonial history of Fiji, but then also the conflicts that were created when indentured communities were brought over in opposition to indigenous communities. When in reality, our communities have lived and worked together for a really long time, but there's this narrative, that we are so separated and we have always been separated. So when we look at, communities in Fiji who have the generational wealth, the money and the access, they really will distance themselves away from indigenous communities, from Itoke communities. When descendants of indenture, a lot of our survival and being able, to live on the land, to survive on the land has always been connected to being in community with indigenous folks. So that's one example. And I think, for Indo-Fijian communities, especially for those of us who have migrated out, so even for my family, we came over to the US like post the coups that had happened in the late 80s. And we only came over because of my family won a lottery visa. So actually a lot of Indo-Fijians who do migrate over to the West, whether it's like Australia, New Zealand, or even US and Canada, they come through these like lottery visas. And, they come from like working class communities. They don't have the generational wealth. And I think when we end up in, these other diasporas in the West, you can see there's like a contrast between us and those who come over from South Asia who have the caste and class privileges. Their parents are really educated. Their parents have gone to universities. They're doing really well for themselves in these places. And then also people who don't come with their families, who come over on work visas or university visas. These are examples of generational wealth that the majority of descendants of indenture don't have. Of course, there are exceptions, but most of our communities don't have these resources to start with. And it's just because our history of being descendants of, indentured laborers. Hopefully that was helpful and clear.
Can I add to that, please?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is this whole concept of wealth itself. It's if you look at the history of ancient India, you'll find all these Hindu scriptures, right? Prominently, the Code of Manu, or what we call as Manusmriti. So basically, what it says is that the Shudras, or the fourth of the Varnas, so they are not allowed to possess wealth. So they are born to be slaves. So their only job is to serve the upper three Varnas. So what is happening here is, and this it has continued for generations. So that's what we are finding is a continuation of that. So it's not that people have just born poor or something. They were made poor. And if you see this general history of India, and when Buddhism was on a decline and Brahmanism was gaining prominence again. So what the kings were doing was they were just grabbing lands from the oppressed communities, and they were doing this land grants to Brahmins. So that's how you can see that this whole thing of accumulation of wealth in the hands of only a particular section of the society. And you'll find the oppressed landless, or they're not even, if you read these scriptures, you would find that there are specific things of what these lowered castes are supposed to be doing, and they're not even allowed to wear ornaments of gold. They have to wear iron ornaments. They're not supposed to dress in a proper way. They are supposed to eat food in broken utensils. So such was a kind of and these are not just scriptures, right? They were the very law of the land. And that till we had a proper system of parliamentary democracy, this was how it was going on. And that's why we are finding it this way right now. So what the Indian constitution does is, in article 39, it gives this concept of distributive justice. So to distribute wealth in such a way so even the lowest of the person is having a dignified life. So that's the basic concept, and that's why you can see the clash of two ideologies, because one is believing in the system of graded inequality and the other one is propounding the doctrine of equality. So you can find the mindsets of the people are rooted in this religious text and the scriptures. That's why there is a prevalence of caste-based discrimination, and untouchability is a worst form of it. So yeah.
Thank you.
There was this thing about post-caste Indian society, and I think that whole concept of post-caste Indian society is a myth. I don't think there is a post-caste Indian society now, or I don't think it will be in the coming few years, at least in our lifetimes. I don't think we'll be able to see that post-caste Indian society.
Maybe we can use that question to, I'll briefly say something about Singapore as well, where I agree with what Preeti just said. The fact that we think that only upper caste people migrate to Singapore and this will cause some kind of a clash is it shows how, yeah, if, we don't, caste still exists very much, even far away from India, within Indian communities everywhere. And in Singapore, that is the case. It's almost as though Singaporeans and Malaysians, we want to react before they react. So we are like, oh, these Indians, they're always here, who are they? Why are they coming? I'm not Indian, I'm Singaporean, It's like we want to what's the word? React before they react. Before they say, oh, you are all a bit different, you're all a bit like you're not the same. But before you can say it, we will say it to you. So there's a xenophobic element to it as well, where it's like, yeah, Indians shouldn't be coming into the country. And this has been, with COVID and all that, has heightened. But I think it's very obvious that there's a caste dimension where we feel like the upper caste migrants who come to the US, to Singapore, to, all these countries, they don't fit into our communities because there's some distinction between all of us. And we all see it, we all know it, but we don't use this language because we think we are past it. But yeah, I think, just end there. Amit, would you like to wrap it all up with any of your last comments?
I mean, I think every one of the panelists has touched upon this, that regardless of your geographical setting, caste and caste-based discrimination in whatever form any of us are experiencing it. Like I said, regardless of our location, it's happening. So there's no denial that okay, and I understand that those of us in India, uh, we see it in its very originality and the original form of caste and caste-based discrimination. And maybe it has changed a bit when it has traveled abroad and it has picked up certain things where it has gone. For example, it might be a bit different in Singapore than how it is in Fiji, because of the history of that place, and how people who took the caste identity from India, how they in a way uh, uh, reacted to the local setting in Fiji or Singapore or in any other place in the UK or any other place. So I think all of us are in agreement that this is a problem, and it's now unfortunately it has become like a global problem because of the whole migration issue and uh, because upper caste dominant people, they have had all those resources in their hand, and they could uh, they could travel outside India for education, for business, and they settle in all those places. But they never left that caste identity, and and how they reacted to the local setting also in a way was influenced by their own background, their own social status. So although they are, uh, they would be called as migrants or migrants from India, but an upper caste family sitting in the US or UK or anywhere else, they have this dual identity. For the outside world, they are migrants from India, but to them, they are still, they are latched on to that Indian caste identity, and that's how they react not only with people in those countries, but also with Indians who then go to those places. So they would want to know what the social status of that person coming into their house is, if he or she is an Indian, and that's how the conversation would then start. That if you belong to a lower caste, it doesn't matter if you have made it all the way to the US and you are now working in a big company, you are still, you know, you're uh, uh, still down the ladder, and that's how you will be treated. So yeah, this thing is everywhere, and so yeah, that's
Thank you, Amit. Yeah, I think you did a great job at summing up that we're all in agreement about something, and I guess we have to wrap up. So thank you everyone, thank you speakers, thank you Preeti, Amit, thank you Esha, thank you Jyotsna for joining, and thank you everyone for your questions. Yes, please follow Badfijigyals, Dalit Feminism Archive, Project Anti-Caste Love, and also Amit, Preeti, and myself. We're on the Global Research Network website. So yes, thank you, and yeah, we will see you next event.